Welcome to the Libra podcast, where education leaders explore the intersection of culture, strategy, and innovation in today's schools. I'm your host, Nate Lichte, and in each episode, we'll uncover the leadership habits, systems, and bold ideas that help districts thrive.
Great. Well, Chris, thanks for sitting down and chatting with us a little bit. Maybe for the folks that are listening, would you mind giving us a little bit about introduction to kind of who you are and tell us a little bit about your district?
Okay. Yeah. So Chris Daughtry, I'm the superintendent of schools at Lewis Cass Schools. We're very rural, in a small area outside of, it's kind of in between Logansport, Indiana and Indianapolis. We have an Air Force base or an Air Reserve base that's really close to us. And then for the most part, we're essentially two small towns. Between them, we don't have a stoplight, so that can kind of tell you a little bit about what we are as a school. Total student enrollment is about 1,250. And so I had a little bit of a tie to this area. I served in the Air Force Reserve over at Grissom, which is the base that's close to here. And then I have family in the area that are just down the road in one of the small towns here at close. So when we were looking at kind of a fit, I was ready to kind of jump back into the superintendency again and get back to close to family. This was just kind of a good fit place for me and an area I knew and kind of felt comfortable with. So.
Oh, wow. So you started you mentioned serving in the Air Force. So what brought you to education and the superintendency? How did that all?
So I started out, I had a friend who was a little older than me, kind of a mentor. And at the time, I was working in a factory, had taken a gap year in college, just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Yeah. And he had seen me, just kind of got to know my personality. He was like, they really need male elementary teachers. And he said, I've seen you. I know your personality. I know your family. I think you'd be great working around kids. So I started doing some subbing and kind of getting an idea whether that was something I wanted to do. And so I started out that way, started out as a third grade teacher, really felt like I was just going to teach the rest of my career. Had no ambition to move up. I loved it, loved teaching. I still to this day enjoy just kind of working with kids and teaching. But during that time, I got in the Teachers Association, and it was in Tippecanoe Schools, which is a larger school corporation. Got tied in with some of the bargaining side and some of the services through the Teachers Association. Got to know the superintendent there, who had been at that school for, I think he had been there 17 or 18 years as superintendent when I was there.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, he saw something in me and said, I think you'd be good in school leadership, and I'd really encourage you to do that. Got an internship as a school principal, or as an assistant principal, and then moved away, got a school principalship, and really loved being a principal and thought that was what I was going to do for the rest of my career until that same guy called me one day out of the blue and said, I have a central office position for you at this same school corporation that I was at before. We got to talking. He was one of those people you didn't really say no to. And so I went back, and it was as a director of transportation for a district that was 450 square miles and had about 12,000 students. Hardest job I've ever done in my life, but also the greatest learning experience. And at one point I even asked him, I said, what was the madness of hiring a teacher / principal who had always been educator to come and do this job? Because it was completely operations. Mm-hmm. And he said, I want to get you ready to be a superintendent. And that was kind of his thing. He's put, there's probably at least 4 or 5 superintendents in the state of Indiana that kind of came through that same tree in Tippecanoe Schools and came up through. His name was Richard Wood. And that was just his mission, was to put talented people out into the state of Indiana. And he always kind of felt it had a dual purpose. One, it helped in the state, but it also helped Tippecanoe Schools look good because, you're sending good people out, and that word gets around. So he's the one that kind of got me to that point. And then I ended up in my first superintendency up in Northeast Indiana. And that's kind of where I've been since. I spent some time as a superintendent there, had another superintendency, and then I went to the state of Missouri for a while as an assistant superintendent to be around some of my wife's family, actually. And then once our kids have kind of grown up and now out of high school, we've come back to Indiana. So.
That's excellent. Wow. I love that. So as you've come back to Indiana and you've come back to, leading a district in a rural community there, being kind of, as you mentioned, it's like a town with one stoplight there. Talk to me a little bit about that. How, as you're leading a rural district of, 1,250 so kids, how do you define success for folks and across the district?
Yeah. So, I think here, really what you look at for success for these kids is one, A, are they continuing to kind of grow in their learning? Mm-hmm. B, are they safe and supported? And I think that's a big thing in small communities. How much do they feel safe? How much are they involved in the school? I think people choose small rural communities a lot of times because of family, and they still want that family culture with their schools. So that's a piece. And then I think just fiscally being sound. This is a very rural conservative community. So, the understanding that fiscally we're going to do things right, and make sure that we can provide the services we need for students. But at the same time, we're going to keep taxes low. We're going to provide what I would call as a premium experience for kids, but do it in a cost effective way. And, we can do that in a lot of ways because really when you're a small school, you have a lot more flexibility and you just have the ability. You're not turning the Titanic, it's more of it's a little bit smaller ship that you can actually move and pivot when you need to pivot to. So that flexibility helps.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Being able to adjust and then just building the relationships. Like there's a lot of benefits to having these, these rural communities that the school becomes such a central part of the the community itself and how they're connecting. As you've been engaged with the local community there, how do you help kind of align district goals with regional values? You mentioned that you've got some conservative values and those different things. How do you find the alignment there?
Yeah, I think one of the important pieces, and it's something I've done in each of the smaller school corporations that I've gone in to start leading, is I set up a time, and it seems like a daunting task, and in some ways it is, but I set up a time just to go out and talk to everybody in the organization. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a lot to laying the groundwork to getting out there. So I just spend, I block out days where I just go out and I talk to people. And the funny part about it is they're not agenda conversations. Mm-hmm. They're simply 15 to 20 minutes and you will get across the gamut. You'll get people that will just want to tell you about themselves personally and their family, things like that. You'll have other people that come in with a very specific agenda that they want you to hear about needs. And you just kind of gather that as both, as like intelligence, but also as kind of that emotional currency that you're going to need when you start actually looking to try to make change. I had a mentor of mine that always talked about making deposits in people's emotional piggy banks. Because it's like eventually you're going to have to make some type of withdrawals from those. So I worked very hard at that piece. And then at the same time, working with this school board was ready because they had a little bit of a period of time where they had interims as their superintendents. Mm-hmm. So they were kind of ready to launch into the strategic planning process. So was able to take a lot of the information I curated from that to really work with the board then to start kind of into the strategic planning process. And I don't love those things to run concurrently. A lot of times you'd like to have a little bit of a gap or a window so that you can gather your intelligence and then move into that. But in this case, they kind of needed it. And it's a situation, Lewis Cass, culturally, there's a lot of people here that are very vested in Lewis Cass. And when I say that, it's not just the parents that send their kids, but it's also the staff. And the one thing that I kept hearing is, why did you choose to come to here when you'd ask a teacher? And they're like, because I grew up here, or my husband grew up here, or whatever it was. So there's a lot of family ties and family connections in the school. So they feel good about their school. And that's something that I hadn't had with, I said that the school that I was at before as a superintendent kind of had that Eeyore syndrome, where everybody, there was like that little rain cloud that followed. So I had to work through that first before we were able to do anything on the strategic side. So here we were ready to launch off. And so we can actually work with the board on creating strategic planning. And then that feeds into then creating kind of a district leadership team that you're going to use to move the ball forward, to move it downfield as you go. So this was kind of a nice place because even though they'd gone through some turmoil and they kind of had enough period of mourning to where they were ready to launch. And that's something I hadn't experienced before.
Yeah. So I'm really interested to hear more. So this is sort of the foundational process of where your strategic plan is coming through. Talk to us a little bit more about, are you in the middle of creating that strategic plan now, or has it already been published and launched, or
yeah, so we created it in the spring of last year. We actually worked through creating it, and we kind of worked it around essentially pillars. We took a look at, we have a district pillar, we have a staff pillar, we have a student pillar, and then we have kind of a pillar that we have for like facilities and the things that we want to do with our buildings to make them better. And then from there, worked with essentially the district improvement team that we had put together to fill in the nuts and bolts on what those pillars would look like and create objectives underneath each of those pillars. And the idea, this district had not really had anybody that did a lot of things strategically. The superintendent that was before me, I think, was really, really good with the financial pieces and staff alignment and putting things into place, but they didn't do a lot as far as strategic planning. So part of the process actually was just working with the board and then working with key staff members on what an actual kind of effective structure looks like, to where, you have grade level / department / whatever you want to call it, teams working together to do the work that feed into the building leadership teams that are really planning for their buildings, but also keeping an eye on what we want to do as a district strategically, that then feed into the district leadership team that's working at the global level and then answering to the board. And then to me, it's kind of one of those that just kind of works and goes both vertically both ways. Things that are initiatives sometimes are pushed down, but also we can have initiatives that are pushed up as well. All the time, kind of keeping our eye on the prize of what is it that we're looking for our students, for our community as we move forward. And, so some key things kind of came out of those pillars, that students being engaged, but also being career ready was one of those key initiatives. And that's both being pushed by what we have to deal with in the state of Indiana, with them looking at moving our high school towards career pathways. Yeah. But also just the understanding that we know with kids, especially in this area, 20 to 30% of our kids are going to go on to college. That leaves a bulk that aren't. And so what career path are they going to go to where they're still able to be effective members of society, but they don't necessarily have to go to college to do those things? And what do the jobs look like regionally so that we can keep a lot of our talent and our kids here? So that became very clear and evident. Another thing that became very clear and evident is that we have 1950s facilities. They kind of look like 1950s facilities. And, there is something there's a lot of school pride here, but moving those facilities more from being institutional looking to being more like a place of learning. And that became very evident as far as it goes. And then the other biggest piece, I think, was just how do we continually keep people, staff, how do we keep them engaged? How do we keep them at Lewis Cass when, literally you could drive an hour and a half down the road and you could see $20,000 increase in your as a teacher if you go down to Indianapolis. So some of those pieces became very clear marks and things that we need to work towards. And so that was kind of the thrust behind the strategic plan as we went through it. Yeah. So now we're kind of in that year one of trying to make it happen.
I get it. Absolutely. What was sort of the initial response? I mean, community and rural districts like yourself, they play a huge piece in getting the district strategic plan executed. What was their response and reception of this? How did you communicate it? That sort of thing to the community broadly.
I think they're pretty hungry for it. And I think part of it is that community pride and that school pride piece. Lewis Cass is very proud. And so you can play on that. And one of the things that Indiana kind of created years back when they opened enrollment is this kind of idea of competition. So, if you take a look at like the actual students that we have that are Lewis Cass students that live here, we're at about 1,000 students. That means that really about 250 of our students are kids that don't live in our district. So there's a competitive aspect for being the drawing card to here. So when you can kind of play up on the idea that we want to be a choice school for these kids, that kind of gets people a little bit juiced up. And then when you start to do, I kind of find when you start to do the little things, it sounds silly, but when you can do physical things that make a difference, it's massive. I mean, and we did some very inexpensive physical things very early on, cleaning up the grounds. We had a lot of buildings out there, for example, that were just oddly colored, like brown. Giving them a significant, just a paint scheme that fits. Yeah. And having a group come in and take a look at our signage and look at the banners that we have around and just really concentrate on trying to make it look like an inviting campus. And it was kind of funny to see how quickly community reacts to those pieces. So doing those tangible things that people can see and hold on to then helps to make it easier to do the non-intangible things, which is really the stuff that goes on in the classroom. And the other piece is, just being honest, a lot of the tweaks you do in the classroom, people really don't notice. It's the stuff like you do a football stadium, people notice. You do new signage, people notice, that kind of stuff. So getting that piece, I think, has led to some excitement towards other things.
Well, and reflecting back on what you mentioned earlier, there's so much pride for your district amongst the community, and getting the buildings to actually share that reflection of that pride. It really does lend to the cultural piece of not only the community, but the district more so, and making it a choice school for districts. With one of your other pillars, you mentioned, staff and retaining and engaging those folks. How do you, when you're in this unique community, and you mentioned pulling in, 200 or so students from outside, how do you attract and retain high quality teachers in a rural setting?
A lot of it for us is actually, can we find a tie-in to the community before? So when we get applicants, we are looking for people that are somehow tied to this geographic region. It's the same reason I think that I kind of got hired here, is that I had a direct tie to this area. So I understood where I'm coming, and I'm making the choice to come here, knowing that, like, I'm in the same boat. I could go an hour or two either way. I probably could make more money, but that's not why I'm here. It's more about the community fit, the cultural fit. And, we can sell a little bit of a quality of the people you're going to deal with, the families, the students. There's a certain quality that we have here that can be harder to come by when you go other places. I mean, I don't want to say it's like going back in time a little bit, but there is a lot of trust. For example, educators are still looked at by the majority of our families as being important members of the community and are held in some esteem. Whereas you don't have to go far down the road to where some of those things have been attacked, and aren't the same. So, really getting people to see that this is their fit. And that's really how I think Lewis Cass has been able to retain people. That being said, that's getting tougher. I mean, because there just isn't the pipeline for people going into teaching that there was. So just sheer numbers, when you take a look at institutions across the state of Indiana, but I really think it's nationwide, that just the number of people going into education is just not as high as what it was. So there's been a lot of attack on public education in this country. I think it's been counterproductive to getting talent.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's sad when I hear a kid that's like, I would teach, but, I've heard that you don't get paid anything, or I would teach, but I don't really want to do that because, you don't get respect, or you don't get whatever the things are, not realizing there are some really advantages to being a teacher. I mean, you get to start vesting in your retirement early on. It's pulled out before a lot of times you even know it. You got good benefits. And quite frankly, if you love working with kids, it's a great gig because you're going to get that every day when you go in. So it's just hard because now been so many attacks that just not as many people want to go into it.
Yeah, it certainly makes it challenging. And, I think that speaks even to something you mentioned earlier, that you had a specific district leader that helped to kind of grow and saw your potential. Talk to me about how, you're kind of continuing his legacy. When we see the challenges that we have right now with not only teachers, but aspiring district leaders and so on and so forth. And you've had a direct experience of someone who saw that in you. How are you working to kind of help, teachers who do want to move into district and central office?
Yeah, so I work in like two ends of that. One, for the past, I think I'm in my 13th year now. I've worked through one of our local universities as a adjunct, and I teach leadership courses. I teach transition to teaching courses, and so I've been working with students there. And my wife is always like, "Why do you still do that? You don't really make that much money." And I'm like, because A, it's selfish, I get to teach, but B, it does help the profession out that we're putting more people into it. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a little tickle in my throat. So, and then the other piece is just continuing to work to identify talent in-house. I mean, I'm working as a mentor for a person actually from the district I came from at Afton.
Yeah.
And I have a person here in-house that he wants to be a superintendent. And so we're working together to help him kind of position and get him the experiences that he needs to move forward. And, so a lot of it's just talent identification and then encouraging them to, hey, have you thought about this next step? And here are some of the steps to go to get there. I'm going to be done in, 6 to 10 years max, probably, with my career. The reality of it is when I look at the number of people that want to take that next step up to be a superintendent or even want to be a building principal, it just keeps dwindling down because people don't want the responsibility. It's hard to get them to see that there's a great deal of joy when you can put something into place that not just affects. And I think that's the one thing that helps me to not just say, I want to go back to the classroom, but there's a great deal of joy that when you see other people succeed in putting together something or putting in place that helps to impact children.
Yeah.
I don't know that you could find a better job than this for that. And that's what you kind of do in this position a lot of times is you don't necessarily make the change, but you set the table and you find the talent that can make that change and you give them the support and then you see that change happen and you give them credit for it. And then there's nothing better than sitting back and watching them get those accolades for moving something forward, knowing that the organization will move forward at the same time. And that's really the joy. And I think you've got to find people that kind of have that heart to do this position. And it even took me some time when I first got into it. It was more of an ego driven. I want to be the leader and then you get in there and you realize you can make change on your own when you're in these leadership positions and you can move things, but the moment you step out, it's probably not going to move any farther, or you may turn around, look behind you and realize there's nobody behind you that's following you into this. Really, as you get into this and helping people understand this is about cultivating other leaders around you to really push an organization forward. And then the day you step out, that organization will continue to move if you set that culture.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a huge piece of it. And I've talked with a couple of districts that are in unique communities like yours and, how the community plays into that and then how, you actually move those strategic plans and those initiatives forward. As you've been kind of working through a number of this, what role does staff voice play in district decision-making and guiding these things
I think that was the key thing that turned around a little bit here. They've really not been a part of a lot of those changes. So having an actual district improvement team to work through and actually be decision makers, and looking globally at here's the things that we know that we need to do to get better, to move forward, but then also having the building leadership teams in place and then actually having work that's produced out of those. That's where a lot of your staff voice comes in that has not necessarily happened in the past. The only challenge I had coming in here with this strategic plan is we had to somewhat, I don't want to say it was not organic, but we had to kind of move it forward with a little bit more of a top-heavy approach at the creating the basics of the plan. So more board than just myself. And I'd rather have more voices involved in that. But the good thing is that I have a board they've been here for a long time. There's a lot of board members that have been here for a long time. So they kind of have a good pulse for the district. So when we started to put together those pillars, they kind of knew these are the things that we need to work on. And then so it was easier then when you go to market to the district improvement team, here's our main pillars. And then as they started to put together, We did a simple SWOT activity, strength, weaknesses, opportunity, threat, to begin our work with that. But then taking what they saw from that SWOT activity and then filling in those pillars, it actually became kind of a natural process. And because we had diversity of voices around the table, you feel like you are inclusive. And then obviously what you hope is that when they get done with the district improvement team, they don't keep it to themselves. They go out and that's the best. I mean, honestly, the best marketing you have for any of these things is people that go out and say, you know what, this is the first time I've actually had a voice in what we're doing.
Yeah.
And then that becomes something that spreads. That's how you cultivate a lot of times more people to want to come forward in the future. So,
yeah, that's a huge piece of it that I'm glad you touched on. When you think about, as you're making these, these iterative changes, you're executing through this strategic plan, budgeting, transparency, and really just fiscal stewardship is a huge component of this too, especially in rural districts. If not more so, because your community, your constituents are all around. What strategies have really helped you maintain financial, stability for the district and iterate through these pillars?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously in Indiana is very locked in as far as your budget goes and what you have. I think when you're going and doing strategic planning, understanding where you are money wise, what you can do and what you can't do. We knew going into this that there was some bonding that was done before I came that allowed us some flexibility on the beautification things. It wouldn't necessarily happen someplace else right off the bat. On the instructional side, the nice thing is you can do things instructionally that are very low cost, but make a big impact. So for example, one of the things that we're working on right now is instructional modeling. And that's something we can cultivate from inside. We don't need to have an expert come in from the outside to tell us how to create a Lewis Cass instructional model. We can use internally our expertise. And actually, I think organically, it's much better when you do that because people buy in much easier if they know it's coming from the teacher down the hall and not somebody that you've paid $20,000 or $30,000 to come in and tell everybody how they're supposed to do that. So when we get finished, we'll actually use an instructional model. It'll say the Lewis Cass instructional model. It'll have best practices. And, this is the way, if you were to teach the perfect lesson from the beginning to the end in your mind, what would it look like? What would be the components of that lesson? The nice thing about that is that we can then in-house train off of that as well. So, for example, if we say we think it's important to really grasp a student's attention before you launch into something and you need a strong hook or an anticipatory set, we can then train off of what does that look like in the classroom? What are some ideas? And again, we can use people that are in-house rather than bringing from outside to do that. It's part of the importance, I think, with small schools, especially of, strategic planning here is a much more in-house type situation. I'm not going to go out and hire a large firm out there to come in and do the work for us. And partially that's because in a small town, A, you got to be fiscally responsible. They're going to be asking, well, how much is this costing when you bring somebody in? And B, there's a certain outsider piece as well.
Yeah.
We can do this ourselves. We don't have to necessarily have that person from the outside. So that doesn't fit with every school culture. It doesn't fit, but for smaller schools especially, I'd say the more you can do organically in-house, it not only saves fiscally, it's very prudent, but it also, there's a sense of pride that comes from that then becomes infectious for staff as they go to make change. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, and especially when you're executing it with the, the staff and the student voice that's kind of built into that, you've got the community that's already has this immense pride within the district. There's that sort of balancing act of which pieces doesn't make sense to actually do in-house and which, there. And it's the leader of the district, that's, really you kind of determining what's going to be best for the kids in the long term is the priority. How do you sort of balance those, in many cases, some things aren't as cut dry. There's just competing priorities. And when you're in a rural district, there's, like you mentioned, especially in Indiana, there's only so much funds available and things. Talk to us a little bit about how you balance competing priorities, especially when it comes into fiscal stewardship.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest challenge I think you've got is that you're always trying to stay focused on kids, and I think that's one of the messages that I try to hammer early on when I'm here. So whenever I do any kind of a presentation, anything like that, I try to bring it back to the kids, because one of the pieces that I've seen in other places is that in schools, especially, you'll see schools that they'll say their kids first, but their decisions when you actually analyze them from the outside are about adults. Mm. And so one of the pieces that you really have to look at when you're in a small school is any decision we make, what is the impact on children? And you want to balance pieces like, at the high school level, the reason why you pick a small school over a large school is your child has a chance to be engaged in anything that they want to be engaged in. Mm-hmm. And we can offer that. And so you want to then balance, and the challenge we have is, can we offer as many things as we possibly can to give students an opportunity to do these things? So you're constantly looking at, how do we balance out, for example, a lot of pride here in our basketball and in our, but there's also a lot of pride in our band. And then how do we provide opportunities for kids that are either into music or into athletics? So it's constantly looking at, how do you provide value for students so that the customer experience when they're done is they feel like they were engaged. And the one thing that we know about students that are engaged is that they do better in school. And so you're getting an academic output out of getting a relational piece to a student being engaged. And that's another piece that we're always looking at, is how do you build like that relational quality? One of the things that we'll do here at Lewis Cass that they haven't done in the past is, at some point we'll put out some surveying to ask students, do you have a trusted adult in the building? Do you have somebody that you can go to when you're not at your best that can be a mentor to you, and use that data as a key point for, whatever that percentage comes back as, how can we improve that going into next year till we get more kids that are engaged and have a trusted relationship with an adult? So there's leverage points like that I think are important. And it's getting that mind shift from, this isn't a place about adults, this is a place about kids, and continue to hammer that. One of the things I talk to about whenever I mentor younger principals, especially younger principals, because they're so much on the ground day to day to day, it's talking about staying on message and staying on point. And it's very hard for them a lot of times, because what you do is you get in and you start to morph your conversations to whatever the conversation you're in with. So it's very easy when teachers, especially that have had a hard day, they want to talk about something negative. It's very easy for you to flow into that negativity. But as the principal, every conversation you have, it carries an impact. And so it's really kind of continuing to stay on whatever that message is that you set for your culture, for your atmosphere of the building. You've got to be the one that just continues to hammer that. Right. And it does get people to think about that. One of the things that people already in this office have picked up, I use the word opportunities a lot. When I see a challenge that comes up, instead of saying it's a challenge, I use the word opportunity. So now I have people that will jokingly say opportunity, and it's, they think it's funny, and that's fine. I hope it is funny. But at the other end of it, I hope that changes the mind shift to stop calling it a challenge. We'll call it an opportunity. Let's see how we can move things forward. So it's just using things like that to help people kind of shift their mind into constantly looking and moving forward as we go through the process. And giving them the freedom. The other thing that I think is really important, especially in small schools, we have the freedom to fail. We have the freedom to try things. And if they don't work, okay, let's do something else. I mean, that's the beauty of being in a small school. We can try something. If it doesn't work, take the feedback, take it on the chin, say I'm sorry, and move on and try something that works after that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that, like rephrasing things into opportunities. I think that's a huge piece of, there's so many competing priorities just in education on a national scale, and that feeds into a community and a rural community especially. So rephrasing those things and thinking about budget challenges and just the way that we're executing our strategic plans, like things will iterate and change, and it could mean failure in a few pieces, but it means the next opportunity comes up. When you think about the future for, Lewis Cass schools, what does that look like, and what does it look like when you've, achieved, key pillars of this strategic plan?
Yeah. I mean, I think the challenge with all small schools in the state of Indiana, and I think it's on a national level, is that there's a continual look from legislators and lawmakers of this idea that we surely we can save some money if we do something. I think the push you'll see continued in Indiana is if we would just consolidate into bigger schools, then we'll save money because we won't have 2 or 3 superintendents in a county, and we won't have 2 or 3 of each of these positions in a county. And so that's going to save money. Not realizing that, like a lot of times smaller organizations, because you're hyper focused, you can actually be very fiscally prudent. I would say our board especially is very fiscally sound with their practices. So just because you combine a couple of districts in one place, you're going to create some inherent challenges. So I say that because that could be something that's an outside force that changes the Lewis Cass school that has nothing to do with really what this community wants. I think if you took a look at what does the Lewis Cass community want, they want the same thing for their kids that they got years back. They want that same experience. They want their kids to learn. They want them to be ready for the job world when they get done. They want them to play football on Friday nights. They want them to be in the band. They want them. Those are the things that they want. And I think 10 years from now, if you could say that that kid is going to get that same experience and like they'll look at that as being a premium experience. On our side, we have to continue to look at how do we continue to position Lewis Cass so as our population dwindles, which it will, because there just aren't as many people that are moving to rural areas as there used to be. As our population dwindles, how do we still attract students in so that we can be large enough to provide those opportunities for kids? And so as I look in the crystal ball, if we've done our job, if I've done my job, 5 or 6 years down the road, you're still going to see kids that have the same types of opportunities because they've got the same level of services that they have now. And hopefully they're a little bit better. I mean, hopefully we've found processes and things inside to give them even more of a premium experience than maybe what they would have had otherwise. I think that's really the future. But again, that can all change with the stroke of a pen in Indianapolis just as easily. So that makes it really hard. You're always wanting to try to predict the future. It does make it hard in this situation to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. As we kind of close out here, is there any kind of closing thoughts or advice that you would have, for other leaders in rural districts that maybe this is their first role in the superintendency? Any kind of closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to my first time running a small rural district. I came in with this idea that I was going to change the world type mentality, and that was the wrong word to use. Build relationships first, cultivate that we mentality, and really trying to get people to kind of push in the same direction, include as many people to the table as you possibly can. And I think really listening to people. I think earlier on in my career, I was good at listening, but I wasn't necessarily good at hearing what people had to say. I think as I've gotten older and I can sit back, I really try to hear what somebody has to say, whether I agree with them or I disagree with them. I think it's important to actually hear them. So, try to keep, and I've had this conversation with several people that I'm like, they would tell you they're not driven by their ego, but anybody that's in a leadership position, you have an ego. There's a reason why you're in that position. I would be fooling myself if I said I didn't have an ego, but trying to keep that out of what is really what you're trying to attain, which is the good of the group, and really highlighting what is the good. And in this case, the group is kids, really highlighting what is good for kids. And I think if you do that, if you come into the angle of this is really about your children, when you're having conversations with community members, even community members that don't necessarily still have kids in our school district, they're still sympathetic to the idea that, it is better for the community if our kids have a great experience. And so I would just tell people that that's kind of your strongest skill is really, it's how you go about relating to people and listening to people and hearing them, and the rest will fall into place. You can do the other work, but making them feel valued is very important.
Yeah. Great advice in closing. I mean, I think we're, listening, building those relationships when you're in those unique communities. It's the best thing you can do. And sometimes when you're not sure of the right decision, that is the best thing you can just do, is just listen and advocate for the kids. Well, thank you, Chris, for just sitting down, talking with us, sharing some of the things that you're working on, and sharing some of the unique opportunities that you've had, not only at Lewis Cass schools, but just in your career within rural districts. Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thank you.